Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to Talk Like a Leader. This week's episode is titled, How to Sell a Change You Don't Like. Now, in many cases, frontline leaders, people in the middle of an organization, are in a position of selling a change that came from somewhere else, came from their upper management. It's driven by customer need. Some change to the business or processes or tools or product offering or pricing, workflow, something created by an external force. And as a frontline leader, it can often be frustrating because you feel sort of powerless. This change is coming from somewhere else and you might not have even gotten a voice in it. And yet you have to get your team on board with it. So there are a couple of things I think you could do that can help you sell this change a little bit better. And really the focus of the 4 tips I'm going to share are really more focused on finding ways for you to get on board with the change. Because I think if you can get yourself on board with the change, it makes it a whole lot easier to sell it to someone else. Now, there's an example I use in our Bud to Boss training where we talk about the idea of going to one neighbor, say on the left side of my house, and selling the boat that is in the driveway of the neighbor on the right side of my house without the neighbor who owns the boat's permission. And when we go through that example and we talk about selling this boat that doesn't belong to me and I didn't get the rights to sell it, most people realize, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. You can't sell something you don't own. And so part of the struggle, part of the challenge of trying to sell a change that's basically handed to you, that wasn't really your idea, and that you have to get your team on board with to make it happen, is that until you own it, even in some very small practical way, you really can't sell it to somebody else. So here are 4 things you can do that help get yourself on board with the change, even if maybe you don't like it or you have some reservations. The first thing to do is building on the idea of the previous podcast episode, assume benign intent, and beware of any kind of negative assumptions you might attach to the motivation or reason why this change is being proposed or why it's being driven. And it's very easy to fill gaps in your knowledge with negative assumptions. And some of those negative assumptions would be things like the people driving this change. This would be the they, the generic they that makes all the decisions we don't really like in life, is that they don't really care about the problem it's going to cause for you and your team, or that they only care about making more money, or that they're dumb, or they don't care about you and your team, those kind of things. This change is happening and you don't really like it. You have some reservations about it. And so gaps in your knowledge about the motivation, about the reasoning, about the desired outcome becomes a negative assignment for intent or motivation in terms of the other person not caring, or they're not very intelligent, or they have a concern about something other than you, something like that. And I'm going to suggest a better way to approach getting yourself on board is to assume that if there are parts of this that you don't understand that are going to cause a negative impact on you and your team that maybe wasn't fairly considered, maybe it's not that the people making the decision don't care. Maybe it's that they don't have all the information you have. Maybe they don't really know of the negative impact. Or maybe actually they have information you don't have that if you knew, you would understand better. Or maybe they have limitations or constraints that are driving their decision. Financial constraints, legal constraints, external pressures on them that maybe you don't understand. Or maybe they just don't realize the level of difficulty. Like I said, they don't have the information you have about what it causes for your team. So when you see these kind of changes happen that create a negative impact on you and your team, let's start with benign intent. The second thing you can do is to make sure you go to the highest level person you have access to, who is closest to the reasoning behind the change as you can get, and work on getting your questions answered. I recognize that sometimes there'll be power dynamic issues or trust issues that limit your ability to do this. I'm going to suggest you do the best you can, though. So you start with benign intent, and then you have a conversation with the person who's driving the change to see if you can better understand the reasoning behind it or the desired outcome. Ask questions, push for answers. Of course, you want to push respectfully and not in an aggressive way. Just get your questions answered and work on building your understanding of the reasoning behind and the desired objective for the change. And as you dig for answers, as you ask questions, please remember that the focus of this conversation is for you to understand the change more than it is for you to object to it. So you want to make sure you're phrasing your questions, approaching it in a way of understanding rather than objecting. And I think you want to have this conversation in private. This is going to adjust based on the situation a bit. If you have a very high trust team where there's a great deal of mutual respect and understanding, then maybe you can have this conversation in front of your team. In most cases, though, having this type of conversation in front of your team could expose your supervisor or the person you're speaking with to perceived, at least, situation that makes it difficult for them to be completely and totally open and honest with you. So you might want to consider having this conversation in private so it feels safe to the other person. And just take into account how it's going to be received by your supervisor when you ask these questions. Is it going to be perceived as objecting to the change, or is it going to be perceived as trying to understand the change? You probably improve the odds of it drifting towards the perception of trying to understand the change if you'll protect the other person by having this conversation in private. And what I've learned is the more you understand, the better you'll be able to communicate. And you just might actually uncover some of the benign intent things you started your assumptions with, that maybe they didn't have all the information, and with the conversation you changed their opinion, or maybe you learned something that changed your opinion. So you get your questions answered in private. Now, as you're having the conversation, you want to be looking for reasons that you can support the change, both for yourself and for your team. Now, I say this offering the idea, knowing that I am a person who tends to notice what can go wrong before I notice what can go right. The act of seeing how this can turn out well actually is a bit of an effort for me. I have learned the value of that effort, and I try to remind myself of that, the importance of that effort frequently. Just instinctively, intuitively, I notice what can go wrong. And in conversation with many leaders, I find that's a pretty common thing. It's not universal. It's pretty common, though, for us to notice the cost of the change over the benefit. And frankly, every change acceptance is a cost-benefit analysis. If it costs you more than it benefits you, you're probably going to reject it. If it benefits you more than it costs you, you'll probably accept it. And the idea here in this suggestion is to remind yourself to be looking for the benefits so that you can avoid the temptation or the tendency to notice only the cost and to put higher weight on the cost than on the benefits. Do a fair assessment of both the cost and the benefits and be looking for the benefits, both for you and your team, so that you can get yourself on board with the change. Now, when you go talk with your team, it's very likely that you will still have some reservations. And your team could very easily ask you about this. They might say something very directly, something like, "Hey, Guy, are you 100% on board with this? Are you totally sold on this?" And it could maybe even sound a bit aggressive or a bit pushy. And if you have any reservations, you don't want to lie to your team. That would be a bad idea. So I think it's okay to be honest about your reservations as long as you express some hope that you'll be able to work it out. Now, there are a lot of different ways you could say this, but here's an example. Somebody pushes you a bit and says, "Are you 100% on board?" or "Are you totally sold?" or some version of that question. You could say something along these lines. "Well, I do have some concerns," or, "This particular point does raise a concern for me," or, "I'm not sure exactly how we're going to overcome this piece of the issue," or something like that. So you're honest and forthright about any reservations or concerns you have. And then make sure you end the statement with some hope for the future, something like this. "I do think that if we get our heads together and think about this and work our way through it, we can probably figure out a way to overcome that. and get to the desired outcome or get the final result. So it would put it all together, would sound something like this. I do have some concerns about this particular point. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do that. I do believe that if we come together and put our heads together, figure this out, work hard on it, we could probably figure out a way to address that. And then we could get the benefits of this change while overcoming some of the challenges. Now, I've just shared 4 things that hopefully will help you get on board with the change and prepare you for the conversation with your team so that you can be honest and forthright when you talk about it. I'm not going to pretend that I think these 4 things are going to make every change magical and make it go smoothly with no friction or no pushback from people. I do think that if you'll do these things, it'll help. And if you'll do them repeatedly over time, it's going to help you get better at selling change that you don't really like. If you can do that, you can talk like a leader.
Hi, this is Guy again. This is like an epilogue to the episode. On listening to it as I was editing it, I don't think I heard anything that I would change. There are just some things I think I need to expand on to avoid misinterpretation or miscommunication. So please come back next week to listen to further thoughts on this topic, and we'll continue the discussion of how you can talk like a leader.
This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.